Remind you of two other events we're hosting this week. We have a pretty busy week. And on Wednesday, we will be screening a film called Lula, Son of Brazil. It's the story of the former president's life. It'll be at 441 Macone at 7 p.m. Our film screenings are free and open to the public, so I hope you all will join us for that. And today, we actually began our 1 month hosting of a visiting scholar, award-winning journalist and writer, Alma Guillermo Prieto, who's going to be on campus for 1 month to teach a course. But on Thursday, she'll be giving a public talk on her project that she's working on to bring attention to the plight of Central and South American migrants. So it'll be at 4 p.m. this Thursday in the Jabal Room over in Stevens. I don't know if you all are familiar with it, but check out our website, and if you look at some of our materials here, you can take that information with you. But for today's event, we're very happy to have Seth Holmes with us. He is the Martin Sisters Endowed Chair and Assistant Professor of Health and Social Behavior at UC Berkeley's School of Public Health. And for the last 18 months, he's been doing field work while living, working, and migrating with indigenous Mexican farm workers, both in the U.S. and in Mexico. He's currently finishing a book on that project, so we're very excited that he's here with us today to share with us some of that work. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Seth Holmes.
Thank you. I also want to say that I caught a cold over the weekend, so I'm currently on cold medication. So if I'm a little slow in thinking through words or responding, blame it on cough syrup. So today, I didn't know exactly who would be in the audience. It sounds like I recognize some faces from public health. I recognize a few people from anthropology, other people from ethnic studies. I don't know where everyone else is from. So the format of the talk today is a little bit of my kind of public health hat and a little bit of my anthropology training. So I'm trained as a cultural anthropologist and as a public health physician. So hopefully the mixture of the two formats will be somewhat helpful. So since a lot of you don't know me, I'll give you a little bit of background just on what I'm passionate about. So there are a few questions that animate my research so far. The first is essentially, how do social inequalities relate to health disparities? How do different kinds of social categories along social class, race, gender, sexuality produce different kinds of sicknesses and embodied health outcomes? Second question is, through what mechanisms are social and health inequalities normalized and naturalized in society and in the health sciences? So by normalized and naturalized, I mean, how are these inequalities, how do they come to be perceived as primarily normal and natural so that people don't question them and oftentimes don't notice them? And then finally, how do these phenomena and these inequalities play out in the context of US-Mexico migration? So you might ask why a physician and anthropologist is interested specifically in indigenous migrant laborers from Mexico. And in my view, undocumented indigenous Mexican migrants are very important for a number of reasons. First, their lives are impinged on by powerful social structures on transnational, regional, and community levels. Second, they're the subject of heated debates related to health and public policy. Sometimes these heated debates are also heated silence, as you might think about the recent discussions about healthcare reform and health insurance reform. And they're a growing population that's structurally vulnerable with significant sicknesses and health burdens about whom we actually don't know very much. So for some quick numbers as to why you should care about this topic, the UN Population Division estimates that there are 175 million migrants in the world, and they estimate that this is up about 50% from a decade ago. Each year, the United States employs nearly 2 million seasonal migrant farm laborers. The National Agricultural Workers Survey indicates that 81% of farm employees are immigrants, 95% of whom were born in Mexico, and 52% of whom are undocumented. It's estimated that there are 1 million indigenous Mexicans in the United States, mostly from Oaxaca, mostly of the different indigenous groups Mixtec, Zapotec, and Triqui. And transnational migration is particularly important in California, the state with the highest percentage of foreign-born workers at about 35%, and the most international migrants per year at about 200,000. In recent history, we need to simply think about the voter-approved so-called Save Our State initiative in the 90s, the recent Watsonville strawberry field violence that was in the early 2000s, and the ongoing debates and silence that I already touched on related to healthcare reform. On a national level, migrant farm workers have extremely poor health statistics in comparison with other groups. While the dominant way that public health people talk about immigrants and health is through the healthy immigrant effect, or in the case of Latinos, the Latino paradox. This often is used to mean that foreign nativity confers a health benefit or protective effect. But if we consider subgroups and particularities in time and space, class, race, indigeneity, etc., this understanding has to be critiqued and challenged. So to be specific, agricultural workers have an occupational fatality rate over 5 times the national average. In addition, agricultural workers have been shown to have increased rates of injuries, chronic pain, heart disease, cancer, and birth defects. Of course, there are many others, but it would get boring if I read them all to you. Of agricultural workers, migrant and seasonal farm workers suffer the poorest health. They and their children have increased rates of many conditions, including HIV, TB, heat stroke, anxiety, sterility, and kidney disease. In addition, farm labor has been shown to have a comparable effect on lung health to smoking. And despite poor health status, migrant farm workers have very poor access to health care. Only 5% of migrant farm workers have health insurance. And although there's a federal migrant health program whose goal it is to take care of all these people, and the program funds many migrant clinics throughout the United States, including in California, it's estimated that this program serves only 13% of the intended population. In addition, despite the increased occupational injury rate, farm workers are excluded from workers' compensation benefits, including health care in most states. So today I'll be talking about participant observation research that I did over the course of 18 months living in these different areas. So started in Washington State up at the top of the map, living in a labor camp on a berry farm, and spent my time 1 or 2 days a week picking strawberries, going with any of the farm workers every time they got sick to the migrant clinic or to a hospital, and interviewing them, interviewing the rest of the people on the farm related to health, related to ethnic relations. At the end of 5 months, I accompanied a majority of the indigenous Triqui people who had been working on the strawberry farm to Central California, where we spent about 3 months living first homeless out of cars and a city park, and then in a 3-bedroom slum apartment with 19 people looking for work and occasionally pruning vineyards, and again accompanying them to the migrant clinics. Next, I spent 4 months in the Triqui home village of San Miguel in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico, in the house of one of the Triqui families whom I'd gotten to know in Washington State that was being constructed piecemeal as family members from the US were sending money. I helped in house construction and harvesting corn. I helped the Triqui children take the ox and goats to pasture. And again, I accompanied Triqui people to the clinics anytime they got sick. In April of that year, I accompanied 10 young men from this village as they ventured to a border town, made contact with a coyote, and then crossed the border into Arizona on foot. Were apprehended by the Border Patrol and put in Border Patrol jail. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, I met back up with them in Central California after they had crossed again successfully and after I was released from jail. Then we returned back to Central California and then again for a berry picking season in Washington State. So to give you a little map of where we're going, first there's a subtle yet intricate hierarchy on the farm based on ethnicity and citizenship. Second, this social structure appears to produce the health disparities that I outlined earlier, primarily through the mechanisms of living and working conditions. This counteracts a common assumption in public health that it's the individually chosen behavior of either the migrant worker or the farm owner that leads to suffering and sickness. Third, there's a lack of social analysis in the practice of migrant health care that often leads to an inadvertent blaming of the patient for their sicknesses. And fourth, social and health disparities come to be seen as natural primarily through metaphors of race and body difference. This last finding fits with Pierre Bourdieu's theory of symbolic violence, which I'll get into once we get to that section of the talk. So the rest of this talk will take place primarily in Washington State, in the Skagit Valley that's nestled between Mount Baker, which you can see here, and the San Juan Islands, about halfway between Seattle and Vancouver, BC.
There's documented means, well, there's U.S. citizenship, and then there's undocumented, and in between there's
U.S. residents. So
there's three states they could be in.
Three kind of primary immigrant statuses, yes, correct. So this is a picture of the Tanaka farm, which is where I lived in Washington State. It's the largest farm in the Skagit Valley, employing about 500 people in the peak of the picking season from June to October. The farm's famous for its strawberries, which are from the Northwest variety, which was bred by the father of some of the current farm growers. The Northwest variety is red throughout and lasts only minutes on the shelf. Unlike the California variety that we're used to buying in the store that's white in the middle and lasts several days on the shelf. The Northwest strawberry is used primarily in the dairy business by companies like Haagen-Dazs that want to be able to write simply milk, sugar, and strawberries on their labels without having to add red dye number 4 or emulsifier number 26. The Tanaka farm is vertically integrated, consisting of everything from a plant and seed nursery to berry production and a processing plant. The Tanaka farm advertises itself as, quote, a family business spanning 4 generations with over 85 years experience in the small fruit industry. On a practical level, employees on the farm grow, harvest, process, and sell berries, supporting the explicit goals of the company. On another level, the structure of farm work involves a complex hierarchy. The structure of labor is both determined by inequalities in society at large, specifically those organized around race, citizenship, and social class, and reinforces these larger inequalities. The structure of farm labor includes several hundred workers occupying many positions from owner to receptionist, field manager to tractor driver, and berry checker to berry picker. Anxieties, privileges, and health status differ from the top to the bottom of this hierarchy. So next, I'd like to run through the hierarchy relatively quickly so then we can analyze it theoretically. The third generation of Tanaka brothers makes up the majority of the executives on the farm, and you can see them sort of in the middle. This is actually during a strike. The executives work seated behind desks in private offices and live in their own houses, many with panoramic views. They work long hours, usually starting before the sun comes up. They often take a little bit of time off during the day to go to a local gym or meet a friend to eat. They worry about farm survival in a bleak landscape of competition and economic globalization. The farm president, John Tanaka, who's pictured here in the black shirt, explains, quote, the challenge for us at a management level is that we've got to maintain our fair share of the market. The difference is that in South Carolina, they have federal minimum wages, which is $5.75 an hour. In Washington, I'm paying a picker $7.16, the state minimum wage, competing in the same market. That's a huge difference. It creates a challenge for a farmer. I'd say the largest challenge for survival is probably offshore competition, for example, China. They could take a strawberry and bring it to San Francisco and deliver it to a restaurant cheaper than we can, and a lot cheaper to bring it to Japan. We pay $7.16 an hour, and in most countries that we're talking about, they don't pay that in a day, unquote. The executives at the same time are attempting to run a family farm that can survive these pressures in order to leave something for future generations. So John Tanaka goes on to explain, it's different than other businesses where you grow a business and then sell out, or you reach a certain profit level that you're comfortable with. In our business, we grow it for the next generation, which means that when I retire, I can't pull dollars out of the company because it would leave the next generation with a big gap. That's what we focus on. The crop managers have private offices in the small field house several miles into the fields from the main farm office, though they spend significant time walking through the fields overseeing what's going on. They work similar hours to the executives and have somewhat less choice in when they take breaks and when they're on duty. They're all Anglo-Americans and live in private houses in one of the nearby towns. The administrative assistants, who work seated at desks in common spaces, live in relatively simple family houses in general near the farm. They're almost entirely white with a few U.S. citizen Latinos. The teenage checkers weigh the berries, enforce the farm rules such as the allowed number of leaves per flat of berries, and spend much of their time waiting. Both the administrative assistants and the teenage checkers worry primarily about the moods and reactions of their supervisors. The remaining workers live in one of 3 labor camps, the first of which holds 50 people and is located 100 feet from the road. Each shack has heating and insulation. The field supervisors who walk outside observing and directing the pickers live here. Some treat their workers with respect, while others use outright racist epithets. Both groups are bilingual in Spanish and English, almost entirely Latino U.S. citizen, along with one Mixteco indigenous man from the Mexican state of Oaxaca. The second camp, located a few hundred feet from the road and holding roughly 100 people, is made up of units with insulation but no heating. This is where those who pick raspberries and apples, as well as a few of the strawberry pickers, live. The raspberry pickers work usually about 12 hours a day on a large harvester machine and are paid per hour. The apple pickers climb ladders up and down to reach the apple trees and are paid per pound, making the most of all the contract pickers. So in case that's confusing, everyone on the farm is paid per hour a certain amount, except there are a few groups of pickers who are paid per pound. They're called the contract workers. That includes apple pickers, blueberry pickers, strawberry pickers. These groups are made up almost entirely of undocumented mestizo Mexicans, mostly from northern Mexico, along with several undocumented Mixtecos and a few undocumented Triquis. The third camp, located several miles away from the farm headquarters, holds approximately 250 people. The shacks have no heating and no insulation. This is where the majority of the farm laborers, strawberry pickers, who are paid per pound, live. They're made up almost entirely of undocumented Triqui indigenous Mexicans, as well as several Mixtecos. Strawberry pickers work outside 7 days a week in Washington state, rain or shine. They must bring in a minimum weight of 50 pounds of de-leafed berries per hour. Otherwise, they're fired and kicked out of the camp because they're paid 14 cents per pound. In order to meet this requirement, they take few or no breaks from 5 a.m. until the afternoon whenever that field is completed. Many don't eat or drink anything before work, so they don't have to take time to use the porta potty. They work as fast as they can, picking and running with their buckets of berries to the teenage checkers. This is Marcelina, a 28-year-old Triqui woman who lived in nearby my shack in the labor camp, and she describes the struggles of a strawberry picker. It's very difficult for a person here. I came to make money. Like I thought, here on the other side of the border there is money, but no. Sometimes the checkers steal pounds. Sometimes rotten berries make it into the bucket. Eat that one, they say, throwing it into your face. They don't work well. This is not good. There in Oaxaca, we don't have work. There are no jobs. Only the men work sometimes, but since there are many children in my family, the men don't make money for me and my son. That's why I wanted to come here, to make money, but no. So this is a conceptual diagram that I came up with to analyze the kinds of hierarchies that I was seeing on the farm. You can see sort of on the vertical axis things such as respect, health, financial security, and control over one's own time and other people's time, going from most to least from top to bottom. And then there are different columns. So hopefully this is helpful to some people who think visually. There's the column of the type of work, from the people who are indoors sitting down, having the best jobs, the people standing up sort of in the middle, and the people who are outdoors kneeling, having the worst jobs. having the least respect and worst health. This also follows for citizenship from U.S. citizen to resident to undocumented. Goes with language from English to Spanish to indigenous languages. And then especially interesting to me was the fact that though many people on the farm who worked on the farm, including the farm owners, saw everyone as Mexican, all the workers as Mexicans, there was a relatively subtle but clear hierarchy among the different groups of people from Mexico, from Mestizo Mexicans from northern Mexico to the indigenous people known as Mixteco from Oaxaca to the indigenous people known as Triqui. Over the course of many tape-recorded conversations and interviews, many of the Anglo and U.S. Latino farm employees told me that the Triqui people are, quote, more simple, unquote, while Mestizo Mexicans stated that they are los indígenas más puros, the most pure indigenous people. And here, considering this hierarchy, it appears that the different indigenous ethnicities are understood through a classic symbolic continuum from savage to civilized, with the Triqui people occupying the place of the savage, understood as backward or simple, and the Anglo and Japanese Americans understood to be modern and civilized. And the Mixtecos are positioned somewhere in between. In many ways, ethnicity, education, citizenship, height, baldness, I didn't fit in the hierarchy the way that I was supposed to. For the purposes of my research, I lived in the housing and occupation and worked in the occupations of the Triqui people, picking strawberries, talking with them about our knee pains and back pains. I often felt sick to my stomach the night before picking due to the stress about making the minimum weight. And for the following few days, I would often take ibuprofen and sometimes go to the hot tub at the local gym feeling awkward about the fact that I had access to the hot tub and other people didn't. Because of my social and cultural capital, the farm executives treated me as someone out of place, giving me special permission to keep my job even when I didn't pick the minimum. At times, they even treated me as a superior, asking me for advice about the future of labor relations on the farm or what they should do for people on the farm. Crop managers and supervisors treated me sort of like a jester, some kind of respected entertainment. They would come and talk with me and joke with me while they were picking into my bucket because inevitably I was always falling behind. They would ask me rhetorical questions like, "Are you still glad you chose to pick?" On the other hand, the other pickers interacted with me, especially at first, with a mixture of suspicion and respect. Many wondered why there was a gabacho chacán, gabacho being the sort of Spanish slang for white American, and chacán being the Triqui word for bald head, picking berries. Several people believed I was a spy for the police, for the Border Patrol, or the U.S. government, and a few people thought that I might be a drug smuggler looking for a good cover. During dinner one evening in his labor camp shack, Samuel, who's the man standing up with a hat on, complained to me about the problems that the lack of resources created in his hometown and said that they needed a strong mayor, known as a presidente. And I asked him if he would be mayor someday. He said to me, "No, you need to have education and money and ideas. You will be president of San Miguel, Seth, and you can do a lot of good. We need a water pump and paved roads." Near the end of my research, Samuel told me, quote, "It's good that you are experiencing how the poor suffer," which had become the dominant way that people spoke about this participant observation project that I was engaged in. He said, quote, "Right now, we and you are the same. We're poor, but later you'll be rich and live in a luxury house, a casa de lujo." I explained that I didn't want a luxury house, but rather a little simple house, picturing sort of a craftsman in South Berkeley or Seattle. And Samuel clarified his analysis of social structures, saying, quote, "But you'll have a bathroom on the inside, right?" The social structures based on ethnicity and citizenship that we've talked a little bit about not only produce the labor and housing pecking order that I've described, but this whole complex maps onto the health disparities that public health people have been talking about for years. The Triqui people inhabit the bottom rung of the hierarchy in the Skagit with the most stressful, humiliating, and physically strenuous jobs. with the most exposure to weather and pesticides. They live in the coldest, wettest shacks in the most hidden labor camp. After the first week of picking, I asked many of the pickers about their experiences. One young female picker stated that she could no longer feel anything in her body at all, that she had gone numb. Her friend replied that her knees, back, and hips are always hurting. One of the young men I saw playing basketball before the harvest started told me that he and his friends could no longer play because their bodies hurt too much. Abelino, a tricky father of 4 who lived near me in the labor camp, explained to me what picking's like. You pick with both hands at once, bent over, kneeling like this, and he demonstrated kneeling all the way down. Your back hurts, you get knee pains and pain here, touching his hip. When it rains, you get pretty mad, but you have to keep picking. They don't give lunch breaks. You have to work every day like that to make anything. You suffer a lot in work. During my field research, most of my friends and family who were talking with me or visiting me where I lived blamed the farm executives for the living and working conditions of the pickers. They assumed that it was the growers' fault that the pickers live in such poor conditions and that the growers could easily rectify the situation. And this supposition is supported indirectly by a lot of books and articles about farm work, most of which describe the details of pickers' lives but leave out the perspective of the growers. This is an aerial view of Skagit Valley from 1936 to 1996, demonstrating not only expanding urban boundaries, the gray and white. While I was doing my research, both Walmart and Costco bought land that used to be farmland. And then you can also see hints that the smaller family farms are being bought up by larger and increasingly corporate farms, mirroring what's been happening in the US overall. So to summarize, the hierarchy on the farm isn't conscious or willed on the part of the farm owners or managers, much the opposite. The inequalities are driven by larger structural forces as well as the anxieties they produce. The stark market competition and precarious future of the farm squeezes growers so that they can't conceive of raising the wages or changing the way the labor camps are without bankrupting the farm and putting everyone out of work. The structural nature of the labor hierarchy comes into further relief when the hopes and values of the growers are considered. The Tanaka farm executives are ethical people who have a vision of a good society, kind of along the Robert Bella in this building kind of good society, that includes family farming. They want to treat their workers well and leave a legacy for their children. Several of them asked for my opinion on how the labor camps could be improved for the workers. So perhaps instead of blaming the growers, it's more appropriate to understand them as human beings impinged on by social structures and inequalities, trying to lead ethical, comfortable lives in the middle of an unequal system. So now that we've considered some of the social hierarchy as well as some of the health disparities at the beginning, I'd like to move on to consider migrant health and the practice of migrant health.
Just really quickly, in those last pictures, it looked like the river started out as white and then it became green. Is that just, what is that about?
That's about coloring.
Okay. Not something weird happening in the river.
No, the river's still there. It does flood every once in a while, but that doesn't look like flooding. So medical professionals in the field of migrant health work under difficult circumstances on many levels. Most clinics serving migrant farm workers have unreliable sources of funding, relying on grants that might come and go. Many lack state-of-the-art medicines and technology. Physicians and nurses in these fields perform many duties for which they're not trained. What the residency director, where I did my internal medicine residency, called non-physician tasks. From requesting free medicines for their patients to filling out social service paperwork. Dr. McCaffrey, a young physician in the Skagit, told me, quote, "Most migrants don't have any insurance, so that's even harder, because you figure out how to start them on a medication and you know they're just going to be off it again wherever they go next." In addition, the clinicians often feel hopeless as they watch the health of their migrant patients systematically decline. Dr. Samuelson, another physician in the same clinic in the Skagit, explained, "I see an awful lot of people just wearing out, 40-something or late 30s or early 50s. They're just worn out. They've been used and abused and worked physically harder than anybody should be expected to work for that number of years. They come out with this nagging back pain. You work it up and it's not getting better and you don't think there's any malingering going on. Malingering is the medical term for tricking us or cheating us or something. It gets to the point where you just have to give them an MRI scan and their back is toast. In their early 40s, they have the arthritis of a 70-year-old and they're not getting better. They're told, sorry, go back to what you're doing. And they're stuck. They're screwed, in a word, and it's tragic. Continuity of care is also very difficult to attain simply because the migrants move every season, a lot of them do. So each clinic has medical records only from the seasons that that particular individual has been in their area. And not only that, but a lot of the clinics have multiple charts for each patient, either because of a difficulty transcribing the name in Spanish or confusion about whether it should be alphabetized by the maternal last name or the paternal last name. Language differences also complicate the field of migrant health. Many of the clinics have English and Spanish speaking providers, although not all of them do, and none of the clinics where I went had any Indigenous speaking providers. Robin, a nurse practitioner midwife in the Skagit Valley, explained, there's a lot of staff who don't want to be bothered getting a trained interpreter. They grab me and say, could you be an interpreter? This person has a right to get a real interpreter and not a 5-minute discussion with me when I'm running from patient to patient. It's just reluctance. It's just that one more step. It's just racism. It's just being overworked because our system is a total train wreck. Are you sure you want to be a doctor? At the same time that most health professionals in this field feel overworked and powerless to change the system, they also feel a commitment to work with this population, a sense of vocation or calling. Many voiced the feeling that Latin American migrant workers deserved high-quality health care, and most described a very personal sense of calling and could remember a particular time or event when they felt this. Abelino, a tricky father of 4 who I quoted a little bit ago, who was talking about the hip pains and knee pains, lived near me in the labor camp, and one day he experienced acute pain in his right knee when he pivoted from one of the rows of strawberries to the other. After continuing to pick in vain hopes that the pain would go away, he told his field supervisor about the incident. The boss said simply, okay, and drove away. Unsure of what to do, Abelino kept picking. 2 days later, work was abruptly canceled, and Abelino and I went to an urgent care clinic. He ended up seeing 4 doctors and a physical therapist, usually without a translator in Spanish, much less in Triqui. In the intervening months, he limped around camp taking care of his kids while his wife took his place in the fields. The urgent care doctor explained that Abelino should not work. He should rest and let his knee recover. The occupational health doctor we saw the following week said Abelino could work provided he didn't bend, walk, or stand for long periods. So Abelino and I went to the farm office to ask for lighter work. The bilingual receptionist told him in a frustrated tone, no, porque no, and wouldn't let him talk with anyone else. After a few weeks, the occupational health doctor passed Abelino's care off to a busy rehabilitation medicine specialist, who told Abelino and me that he must work hard picking strawberries in order to make his knee better. She asked me to translate that he had been picking incorrectly and hurt his knee because he didn't know how to bend over. Notably, in her rush, she hadn't asked Abelino very many details about his work, including how he bent over. Years later, Abelino still tells me that he has occasional knee pain and that, quote, the doctors don't know anything, unquote. Crescencio, another tricky man living near my shack, approached me after picking one day and asked if I had any medicines for headaches. He explained that every time a supervisor calls him names on the job, makes fun of him, or reprimands him unfairly, he gets an excruciating headache in the center of his head. He told me that the headache makes him prone to anger with his wife and children, and that he didn't ever want to become violent with his family and wanted help with his headaches before this could happen. He had seen a few physicians about it in Mexico and the US, as well as a traditional Triqui healer, but nothing seemed to help. The only thing that made his headache go away was drinking 20 to 24 beers. Then he would wake up without a headache. He had to use this remedy once or twice a week in order to deal with the problem. I suggested he go into the local migrant clinic to see if they could try something new for his problem, and I, at that point, was just finishing my medical training and imagining kind of the way you would go through systematically all the different medicines for migraine headaches and all the diagnostic tools for headaches. A week later, he told me that he'd seen one of the doctors in the clinic, but that she, quote, didn't know anything, unquote, which I heard a lot about physicians and was troubling given that I am one. Later, I interviewed this physician about the interaction. She was trained in one of the best medical schools in the US and chose to start and run this clinic because she wanted to ameliorate the suffering of Mexican migrant workers. She was very smart, idealistic, caring, and hardworking in the midst of a busy, understaffed, and unreliably funded clinic. After looking at the notes in the medical charts, she explained, well, yes, he thinks that he's the victim and thinks that the alcohol or the headaches make him beat his wife, but really he's the perpetrator and everyone else is the victim. Until he owns his problem, he can't really change. Nothing really works, none of these migraine medicines or anything, but put people in jail because then they see a show of force. That's the only thing that works, because then they have to own their problems as theirs and they start to change. He came to see me once and I told him to come back 2 weeks later after not drinking, but he didn't come back 2 weeks later. Instead, he came back a month later. It looks like he told the doc he saw that time something about when people at work tell him what to do, it makes him mad, and that's what gives him headaches. He needs to learn how to deal with authority. We referred him to therapy. Do you know if he's going to therapy? Despite this physician's impressive idealism and good intentions, founding this migrant clinic in order to take care of this group of people, her busy, difficult job and her education and the lenses that she was given in her education didn't allow her to see the social context of the suffering of her patients. In this case, social, economic, political, and symbolic structures impinge not only on migrant workers and their health, but also on the health professionals who are trying to serve them. In The Birth of the Clinic, Foucault describes his theory of the clinical gaze. He explains that there was a change in clinical medicine coincident with the advent of cadaveric dissection. Whereas physicians used to focus on the words of the patients and correlations between those words and body parts and cures, the symptoms as expressed by the patients, they began to focus instead on the diseased organs, treating the patient more as an object or a set of objects making up the body. In Foucault's description, the primary question changed from, quote, what is wrong, to, quote, where does it hurt? As would be expected within this paradigm, the rehabilitation doctor and the migrant health doctor described earlier saw the tricky bodies in their offices, yet weren't able to engage with the human and social context of everyday life that led to their suffering. Yet, since the time of Foucault, the paradigm of biopsychosocial health has been taken up by medical schools, medicine, and public health. It was first described by George Engel in the 1970s. Beyond the acontextual gaze theorized by Foucault, physicians in North America today are taught to see behavioral factors in health, such as exercise, diet, sexual behavior, and substance use. Behavioral health education has been added as part of this laudable move to broaden health education. However, without being trained to consider the social structures that shape the suffering of patients, health professionals and public health practitioners are equipped to see only biological and behavioral determinants of sickness. Thus, well-meaning clinicians and public health practitioners are limited to blaming the sickness on either the patient's genetics or body in some way, or the patient's behaviors. For example, the assumed incorrect bending while picking, or the supposed trouble with authority, without appreciating the hierarchies that position their patients in particular riskscapes in the first place. Ironically, the progressive move to include behavioral health in medical education without the correlate inclusion of social analysis may be exactly that which limits clinicians to blaming the victims of health disparities. So how is it that stark social inequalities and health disparities are largely unchallenged and unquestioned in society? The second question that we started with. How have these social and health inequalities come to be understood as normal and natural in society? And in broader terms, how do certain groups of people come to be written off or come to be understood as deserving their poor social standing or their poor health? Particularly helpful to me is Pierre Bourdieu's theory of symbolic violence. This theory explains, I'm laughing because there are people from my theory class who worked with me on theory this fall. So this theory explains that we perceive the social world through certain cognitive schema or cognitive lenses. These schema are issued forth from the social world around us, and therefore they include all the social inequalities that are in that social world around us. Thus, when we look at the social order through these lenses, we misrecognize it as natural because the inequalities out in the world match the lenses that we are perceiving it through. And of course, there are lots of instances you can think of when that might not be the case. For example, if you grew up in Italy and now we're living in Berkeley, things might be slightly different. When I asked a mestiza Mexican social worker why Triqui people have only berry-picking jobs, she explained, "A los oaxaqueños les gusta trabajar agachado." Oaxacans like to work bent over. Whereas she told me mestizo Mexicans, whom she called simply Mexicanos, get too many pains if they work in the field. Later, I asked the farm's apple crop manager why I hadn't seen any Triqui people harvesting apples, the field job with the highest pay. He explained, "Oaxacans are too short to reach the apples. They're too slow. They have to use ladders a lot more than some of the other guys, and besides, they don't like ladders anyway." He continued that Oaxacans are perfect for picking berries, quote, because they're lower to the ground, unquote, which was mirrored by a California state senator in the 1990s, I believe it was. These statements show a perception of bodily difference along racial lines that serves as the lens through which symbolic violence occurs. In this way, each category of body is understood to deserve its relative social position. Because of their natural characteristics, indigenous Mexican bodies are understood to belong picking berries, as opposed to other jobs. On the other hand, mestizo Mexicans and white Americans are understood to have bodies that don't fit in the picker category and belong in other positions. At the same time that symbolic violence involves the normalization of the social and health position of other groups, this theory also includes a subtle sense of internalization, of a naturalization of one's own social group and one's own position. So one doesn't perceive only others, but also oneself as belonging in preordained positions. During my second day picking strawberries, a tractor with long metal extensions spraying something in the air drove through the field while we were picking. I asked a supervisor what it was. "Do you really want to know?" he asked. And I said yes, and he said, "Dangerous insecticides," and shook his head. The supervisor went on to explain that these white patches on the strawberry leaves are largely due to pesticide residue. I later noticed danger signs posted on several large canisters surrounding one of the hand washing and outhouse stations at the entrance to the field. Strawberry pickers worked every day without gloves as the visible pesticide residues dissolved in the mixture of berry juice that stained all of our hands maroon for the next day. If they ate anything, they ate it in the fields while picking, often without washing their hands, in order to save time and make the minimum weight. The same week as the spraying described above, I received a video I'd ordered from the United Farmworkers about the health risks of pesticides. I watched it on an old VHS player in my shack in the labor camp with several of the Triqui pickers who lived nearby. Afterwards, I asked them what they thought, and one of them told me matter-of-factly, "Pesticides affect only gabachos, because your bodies are delicate and weak." And another one confirmed, "We Triqui are strong and hold out, aguantamos," was the verb. The others nodded. Their sentiment was repeated many times. And in this way, Triqui people show a sense of ethnic pride that might be helpful and even necessary in the midst of a painful history of discrimination in Mexico and the US. At the same time, there is a sense in which this pride may simultaneously justify their position in the labor hierarchy. In effect, Triqui conceptions of honor at having strong, tough bodies might aid in making the destructive impact of their social and labor position invisible. So, to return to the questions we started with, we've seen that there's an ethnicity citizenship hierarchy on the farm, that the ethnography suggests that this social structure determines health behaviors and health disparities primarily through living and working conditions. and perhaps most interesting, at least to me, are the ways in which these inequalities come to be understood as normal and natural. For example, the health practitioners who are impinged on by different kinds of lenses given them in education and different kinds of social structures, who tend not to see the social determinants of health, but rather inadvertently and subtly may blame their patients for their sicknesses. And more broadly, we've seen that social and health disparities are understood to be natural due to perceptions of ethnic body difference, including perhaps forms of ethnic pride. These processes of normalization and naturalization, I would argue, are critical to understand because they serve to justify social structures and social inequalities. This justification then fosters their persistence and reproduction. So this is my last slide. And this is just my kind of quick attempt to think through some of the places where social action, social change might be possible. We've talked about a bunch of things, including representations and how those affect practices and behaviors and who's considered at blame, etc. So I'll just leave that there and we can take questions. Start with you.
There are a lot of Oaxacan organizations in California, and I just wondered, and Oregon, I don't know about Washington, wondered if they were present, if you see them as a social force for change.
In Washington, on this farm, there weren't very many organizations of any type involved. There's one group called Tierra Nueva that does largely kind of social work and different kinds of chaplaincy, religious-based organization that would intercede and help, especially the indigenous pickers when things came up. In California, I did some research with the Frente Indígena Oaxaqueño Binacional, which at that point didn't have very many Triqui people involved. It was mostly Mixteco. And I understand that's been shifting a little bit since then, but at that point the people who I knew who were Triqui were not involved there. In Oregon and to some degree in Washington, there's PECUN, the Piñeros y Campesinos Unidos, something like that. But the people who I was involved with weren't involved in that organization either. So, yes?
My question's more methodological.
Yeah.
And it's really simple. How did you get access?
Probably like any kind of research, it was through all kinds of specific and particular times and meetings and connections. So I started one summer during graduate school in Watsonville, doing research there, and had a really hard time getting access to any of the farms. Got an amazingly powerful runaround from the farm owners there. I think part of that is because there are Berkeley and Davis and UCSF and UC Santa Cruz people going there all the time, and because maybe partially because of a history of unions and labor organizing that makes the growers suspicious. In Washington State, I went to visit a friend of mine who grew up next door to me, actually in Spokane, Washington. And then she had become a Methodist minister and moved to the Skagit Valley. I went to visit her, and the owner of this farm went to her church, and she introduced me, and I told him and his wife some about my interests, and he said, "Oh, that'd be great. You could come live here." And I thought that was wonderful. And then Tierra Nueva, one of the founders of Tierra Nueva and social worker and chaplain there, had been a backpacking guide in the same nonprofit that I was a backpacking guide with in the Sierra Nevada during college. And so that was another little, one point helped me get access to kind of the farm itself, and one point helped me get access to the pickers and meet some of them. So that's sort of how I started, but I don't think my research would have worked very well if I hadn't been living there. That's really how I got to know people. So, that's my answer. I don't know if it's not a helpful plan necessarily to how to do other kinds of research, but
I wasn't interested in the plan in terms of what your protocol was. That's just how'd you get on the farm? How'd you
Yeah.
get to the campus?
that's how. Yes.
If there was a law requiring, I'm trying to, my subject heading is blood diamonds. I don't know that word.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a federal law requiring all credit card companies for every purchase, there'd be a karma value of how many people died, or and so people would have their bank account and they'd have their karma account.
Right.
And to pay it down, they could do some good acts. I mean, I'm just thinking of a sort of a solution, sort of a simple technological legislative solution.
Right.
Flatten the planet in terms of who dies for their strawberries and who.
So one problem is that we don't know the background, the history, the human relations that go into the products that we buy. We probably all thought to some degree about the fetishization of the commodity or different things like that within capitalism. But specifically in this case, for example, we picked strawberries on this particular farm that were then packaged by a larger grower out of California. So if I wanted to find these strawberries in at the grocery store, I couldn't, because it would say the name of this other grower and it would say California, because that's how
The karma values would be very radically different.
they are very different. I mean, this farm, it was very active and interested in trying to make things as good as they could.
What was the result of the strike?
Wait, I want to answer the overall question first. So the people who started organizing for the organic label originally were organizing not only for pesticide-free, but also a sense of kind of fair labor practices and treating workers well. And then in the process of that becoming sort of systematized and certifiable, that was lost, because it was a lot easier to say pesticide-free than to figure out exactly what all those other things meant and figure out whether the people reporting it to you were framing it correctly and all of that. So during my field work, some of those people who had been organizing for the organic label started organizing for a domestic fair trade label, which exists in Europe and other places, but we don't have here yet. And in lots of ways, that would be a very helpful thing for us to have some sense of where things came from, but right now we don't. So it's hard for us to make choices about how we want to spend our money or what we want to support. And the answer about the strike, super briefly, one day, without organizing ahead of time, as far as anyone has told me or anything I can tell, one day in the middle of a rainstorm, the day after several people were laid off, late in the season, so all the strawberries are smaller, one of the field supervisors announced in some certain way that the pay per pound would be lessened. And it was raining and it's cold, and it was I don't remember exactly when it was probably September or something. People started whistling, pickers started whistling, and once enough people were whistling, I guess that was the kind of consensus that it was time to leave. And I had heard the whistling before, but nothing came of it, so I didn't know exactly what it meant. So everybody essentially walked out, not 100% everybody, but almost everyone walked out. And that group, Tierra Nueva, translated 20-something grievances that they had against the farm and helped set up a meeting between several of the pickers and the farm owners, the growers. And the discussion in some ways was very interesting, because the farm owners, like I had said, weren't very aware of the different kinds of Mexican people occupying different positions on the farm. And they were kind of visibly upset by that and wanted things changed and wanted people treated more fairly. And for the rest of that season, which was a few more months, things did change. There were lunch breaks, there were bathroom breaks, the pay was reinstated to the initial rate. But then of note, the next year, partially because all the group of people who were picking changes and mixes all around, it basically went back to the way it was before, although the farm owners were now aware of these things, they were still, in some ways, kind of freaked out because their neighbor farms had to shut down. So it had some effect for a little while, but not in a strong, lasting way.
And is there a better way to visualize this than the movie
Let-
Grapes of Wrath?
Let's talk about that afterwards. I should take questions from somebody else. Yeah.
Lawrence, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
My name is Yana. I'm a graduate student. I'm doing research with grape pickers in Chile. So a lot of similarities and some differences also. I was wondering if you could talk more about the contract field workers and the hourly field workers and what determines, you said the majority are paid by hour. What determines the number of workers that are paid by hour or by piece or by pound?
So on this farm and most of the farms I know, at least in Washington, it's all determined by your position, your post. So if you're a strawberry picker, it's all by pound. If you're a raspberry picker or a manager or a checker, it's all by hour. So that's how it's determined. And then the way that who gets which kinds of jobs are determined is a lot of unwritten, non-specific things. You know, whoever is doing the hiring for a certain kind of job may often give that kind of job to friends of theirs or people who they get along with or who seem like them or who come from the places that they're from, etc. So.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions.
Oh, I'd read that there's a lot of violence in the Tricky villages back in Mexico. Is that true? Is it just some areas and it was from outside people too? Not
Yeah. So interestingly, it's not just outside people who say that Tricky people are violent. It's also Tricky people who say that.
I thought it was outsiders coming in and like sort of preying on people in the villages.
Well, I mean, in my experience, I have a chapter in my book where I write some about the warnings that Tricky people gave me about not going out at night in their villages because they're bad people who will take advantage of you. While I was doing my research, I never saw any violence, and I was living with them for 18 months. So some of it appears to be kind of like Adrienne Pine wrote about in her ethnography in Honduras, Working Hard, Drinking Hard, where it's kind of a internalization of what other people are saying about them. And some of it reminds me also of Michael Tausig's work on, what's the word he uses for the reflection? Yeah, mimesis, exactly, of course. Where there's a certain kind of violence going on that is justified. Well, in one of his examples, there's a certain kind of violence being done to, for example, Indigenous people, but it's justified by the colonial powers because they're calling the other people violent. And there's a lot of violent history against the Tricky people, a lot of kind of land wars and being pushed out of land, and so it's a good question. And
Does that drive the migration at all, or is that just like a...
the people who live on the edge of Tricky villages often end up moving and leaving their land there because there are land disputes and violence along the edges. The people who are but most of the people who migrate, it's not because of that violence per se, it's more because of, you know, what Paul Farmer or other people would call structural violence. It's more about the way that opportunities and resources are structured in the world. One more. Sure.
Just sort of 3 quick comments. I don't know if you want to respond to those. One is like, how do you really, I mean, for also you're going to write about it.
Yep.
I was really intrigued about this notion of a company because, you know, at some points, you know, from your kind of account came up like Levinas, you know, the kind of alterity that we do not understand and brings us together.
Right.
And then I was thinking, you know, the Ken Loach bread and roses, and, you know, when you get together with others, the question of serendipity and, you know, kinship. So how would you sort of, in your overall writing, sort of conceptualize more this form of sort of like doctor or company? Because I think that there is a like, a kind of complexity that it would be nice to see how you handle that. The second point that I really liked also is the notions of the kind of way in which effective labor is changing the kind of farming in the US, so that there is kind of this endangered sort of family farmer side, and I would like to know more about how this kind of effective notions of the family business being under attack is used as a way of complying labor and, you know, making this kind of farmer more compliant, or maybe not, you know, and it's an interesting, it's an interesting area of analysis, I think. And also I'm thinking about post-Fordist kind of notions of change of labor, and probably you could think those shift also in relation to that. And finally, I was just thinking, comparatively speaking, where some student work in sort of southern Ontario, and sort of interchange, also with the relation between sort of Indigenous labor, Aboriginal labor, and migrant labor. And also basic, comparatively speaking, you know, in Canada, how much of that problem is with bilateral agreement, which is totally different from the California but a lot of the issues are also to do with different temporalities that bilateral welfare agreement have with the life instead of the migrants. So a lot of things that happen as, you know, long time disabilities issues kind of fall through the net because it's exactly when they come back, and so when they come back, you know, so the welfare, Canadian at least, welfare state doesn't cover. So we'll be really intrigued to think how you think a sort of longer time of temporalities, especially with the sort of Bourdieu analysis, which I think at one level takes into account really, and another doesn't, how, for example, disabled bodies are carried through this kind of different multiple temporalities across states. So just kind of three standards that would be useful.
Yeah, good questions. To start with the last one, I tend to think of, about temporality kind of over the human body in terms of disabled bodies and elderly bodies that aren't going to work anymore, and productive bodies, and then sort of young bodies that are playing and, you know, pictured as either at danger because they live in a labor camp or whatever. I tend to think with Michael Burawoy's article on labor migration, which actually was written in 1976, 1 year after I was born, but I still find it super helpful, where he writes about the kinds of tacit agreements and understandings and disagreements in labor migration, such as California and Mexico, as opposed to bilateral agreements with, for example, with Canada, where it's more official. So with California and Mexico, there is a nexus of economic agreements that, for example, Jerry Brown stepped in the 1980s and asked the INS to stop doing raids on farms because it was too disruptive to the economy of the state, and these raids were stopped. So there's an economic understanding, and there are these economic agreements about who can work and who's needed to work and which kind of bodies are the appropriate ones to work in certain jobs. But then there's also this legal / political kind of opposing narrative about illegality, and you're not allowed here, you don't have rights here, that allows the state here to benefit from a person when they are a productive working body, because they come through the narrative of illegality and are in some ways, because of that narrative, actually ideal citizens, functioning as ideal citizens who never speed and always get their headlights fixed because they don't want to ever be pulled over, but doesn't have to overall, although this has changed somewhat since the tightening of the border and more people are staying here, but doesn't have to pay for them, for their bodies during kind of reproduction, either when they're children or when they're elderly and convalescing. And in the group that I do my research with, most of them, after they're not able to work anymore, if they have an injury or if they grow old enough that they're not working anymore, they go back to Mexico. So the disabled bodies among this indigenous picking group kind of disappears back to Mexico and is taken care of back there through subsistence farming. and babies overall are taken care of through subsistence farming, and then the only thing that our state has to pay for is the time when they're working. So that's one way to think through temporality. In terms of the endangered family farmer, there's definitely a strong sense of anxiety, fear, kind of urgency that all the growers who I knew in the Skagit Valley kind of felt and spoke about. And a lot of them were very involved in different nonprofit organizations like Skagitonians to preserve farmland and things like that. Getting involved in political, measures to kind of make it, in some ways, stave off what they felt like was inevitable and allow them, one more generation of being able to do what they do. And there's a sense, when we kind of changed, the lens that I gave you was sort of a small lens looking primarily at the farm and the hierarchy on the farm, but then of course you could do a much larger lens and look at those family farms in relationship to the seed producers and what laws they're enacting, for example, with Monsanto and other things, or you could look at corporate farming and what's happening with that, or the engineering of different kinds of berries and how that relates to the family farmer. So it is after 1:15, so I'll talk with you more about those ideas.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Thank you.